and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11.2 meta for each stage of the game. The release of set 4.5 has been a roller coaster so far in the meta, especially since there was a B patch. We saw the rise of several new compositions as well as returning builds from the original set 4. And of course, there's plenty of reroll builds to press D for. We'll cover the items commonly used in the meta along with breaking down each stage of the game. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to begin, let's delve into the item meta. We've seen a bit of a regression in the item meta as set 4 was all about flexibility, while 4.5 is about obtaining specific items for specific champions. Making aura items or generally strong items that were usable by multiple champions was the staple previously. But we've seen so far in 11.2 that making early items can have an impact on what champions and compositions you'll be able to play later in the game. The reason for this is that a lot of carry champions want rather specific items to do well. And there's not a lot of overlap for each of those champions. For example, Olaf needs Deathblade, which is useful on Xayah or Talon, but not useful on Aurelion Sol or Katarina. Those two prefer rod-based items like Gunblade, but Katarina prefers Infinity Edge over the jeweled gauntlet that Aurelion Sol uses. While the number of carries are fairly diverse, the items can be a bit limiting, especially since the meta is all about slamming early items. That means you need to be aware of what options you're potentially removing when making early game items. Of course, there are still a few universally good items you can look for like Sunfire Cape or Hand of Justice, but those don't make up the core 2 items for mid to late game carry champions. Let's shift focus over to components at the beginning carousel. Really any component except for the cloak can be useful, but it really depends on what you as a player lean towards. Are you going to focus more on rerolling? In that case, look for a sword, rod, or bow, as those builds tend to use those components heavily. Maybe you're just wanting a good early game, in which case Chain Vest, Glove, or Tear can be good. Chain Vest can potentially become Sunfire Cape, which is one of the best early game frontline items, or it can become a Locket, which also has a lot of value early on in the game. Glove builds towards Hand of Justice, same with Tear. So overall, what you go for depends greatly on your game plan. In general, you can just always grab a contested component so you're not relying on finding it later. That means you'll be looking for sword, bow, or glove from the beginning carousel. Sword builds into several meta carry items, with one of the best being Deathblade, while bow is necessary for RFC, Runins, and Rageblade. Glove, as mentioned, is great for Hand of Justice, but also can make either the Jeweled Gauntlet or Infinity Edge. Cloak tends to be the only component you're going to want to avoid, if possible, from the beginning carousel, simply because finding one later is really not that difficult, and it has far less use than the other components early on in the game. Belt is also on the weaker side, but it can be used for Sunfire Cape or even ZZ Rot. Tear is somewhat in the middle of the pack, as it can be a bit limited in its use since there's champions that want to use blue buff, but again, Hand of Justice is great and Chalice is still a decent option. All in all, the item meta is both diverse but somewhat rigid, since the early game item choices can impact what compositions you play for the rest of the game. We'll touch on the specific items for carries later, but for now, let's begin talking about each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. The early game starts right from the beginning carousel up until the early rounds of stage 3. Since we've already covered the carousel, let's start at stage 1. The early game in general is still the same as always. Build a strong board and try to preserve health as best you can. While this is generally done by leveling aggressively and using your gold, there is also the option of playing reroll comps. Some will play out normally like Zed or Warlords, but others like Duelist, Diana, Nasus, or Nidalee will want to avoid leveling early. The decision when to play these reroll builds is usually decided no later than Krugs and as early as the end of stage 1. Basically, if you're presented with a 1-cost chosen that can be rerolled, you can hold off on leveling to see how the rest of stage 2 plays out. If you're not hitting those super early chosen champions, then the recommended route is to build a strong board as usual and level aggressively. Stage 2, as mentioned, is where the important decisions are made in regards to playing reroll comps. If you have, for example, a chosen Yasuo on 2-1 and hit 2 more Yasuos by Krugs, then you have a great opening to play a Duelist reroll comp. Same with other builds like Spirit Diana, Warlord Nidalee, and Divine or Siphon or Nasus. For every other player that hasn't hit one of these champions or simply just doesn't want to reroll a 1-cost champion, then aim to level early on. This can be done on 1-4 by pre-leveling to 4, 2-1, or 2-2. The goal when leveling early like this is to increase the odds that you hit a 2-cost champion, specifically a chosen 2-cost. From there, you can look to level to 5 either by pre-leveling at the end of 2-3 or on 2-5. The decision when to do so is based on your gold. If you hit 10 gold at the end of 2-3, then it's better to level on 2-5, otherwise pre-leveling is best. Level 5 is the same goal as early leveling to 4 since you still want to look for a strong chosen champion, and you'll have increased odds at hitting 3-cost champs. After 2-5, the stage plays out normally as building up your economy is the general goal. And as mentioned, if you did hit an early chosen and have a good start for one of those reroll compositions, then your plan should be to wait on leveling and begin slow rolling once you hit 50 gold. At this point, let's shift over to the mid-game since we're moving into Stage 3. Stage 3 is a pivotal point of the game because this is where the pace of the lobby is dictated by the amount of players playing reroll builds. Besides 1-cost champions, it's also where 2-cost champions may come into play, such as Chosen Zed. There's a few reasons as to why rerolling is such a big focus of the current meta. One reason is that since there's a lot of changes brought with the release of Set 4.5, it's simply easier to play focused compositions like reroll builds. It's much easier to play these types of compositions because you have a limited number of champions to look for, and being flexible isn't a worry. Of course, later on in the game, you will need to do well if you want to place in the top 2, but reroll builds are usually a quick and easy way to top 4. Another reason is the introduction of the consumable loaded dice. If the game ends up dropping it relatively early, it can be used to hit a 3-star champion much quicker than usual. So with those reasons in mind, it makes a lot of sense for the meta to revolve around these builds. From here, let's focus not on how to play reroll builds, but the general meta if you aren't playing them. In Stage 3, the goal is to level to 6 on 3-2, preferably no later than 3-3. If you need to roll at this stage of the game, as in you've been losing a majority of the rounds prior to this, then roll. Roll down as much as needed to stabilize your board, meaning you hit several upgrades to your existing board and a decent chosen. While you do want to roll until you're in a good position, make sure you don't dip below 10 gold, preferably staying at either 20 or 30 gold. There's a few strong compositions you can look for during this roll down, such as 6 Warlords, Chosen Zed, Akali with Assassins, and Frontline. Kindred along with Spirit is also really good to look for. Shyvana and Brawlers is another fantastic Stage 3 board, as Brawlers are quite a bit stronger in 11.2. The rest of Stage 3 is all about saving gold with the intent to level to 7, so let's move into Stage 4. Aim to hit level 7 on 4-1 unless you're playing a 1 or 2 cost reroll composition. In those cases, you can keep slow rolling to hit your 3 stars, but you may need to all in all of your gold if you aren't hitting what you need. If you rolled during Stage 3, you should be okay to slow play level 7. Roll if you need, but for the most part, the goal for Stage 4 is to get to level 8 sometime between 4-5 and 5-1. This means saving gold as best you can, but again, if you're losing drastically, then roll to stabilize. One of the issues with playing to hit level 8 is that reroll builds can punish your board since they'll hit their power spikes before you do. This means you do need to be diligent in scouting to see the general strength of the lobby to determine whether you need to roll or not. Let's now move into Stage 5, where we'll cover level 8 and a few of the compositions you can look for at this point in the game. As mentioned, you'll want to try to hit level 8 between 4-5 and 5-1. Once you've leveled, the goal is to begin working towards a late game comp. This means selling your early chosen, unless it's needed for your build, and trying to find a good 4-cost chosen. There are a lot of options, but most of them are somewhat dictated by your items. Deathblade, Runins, and Infinity Edge will aim your composition towards Orloff Slayer, Xayah Elderwoods, or Talon Enlightened. Infinity Edge is also a staple item for reroll carries like Diana, Akali, or Katarina. Bow-focused items like RFC or Rageblade are essential for Kayle Executioner, while rod items like Jeweled Gauntlet and Deathcap are needed to play Aurelion Sol. Another item to consider is Gunblade, which is also good on Aurelion, Diana, and Katarina, which can also be replaced by Hand of Justice. Overall, aim to play what items and components you have, but don't be too greedy with your rolls. Perfect chosen champions are great when you hit them, but sometimes you have to go through secondary options, like say a Siphoner Morgana or a Vanguard Aatrox. It's not as easy to play flexibly because of the items in the current meta, but don't tunnel vision on specific champions, as you can easily dig yourself into an unwinnable position. Once you've rolled and begun to form your composition, the plan should be to continue stabilizing your board as best you can. With that, let's move into the late game. This will be around the end of Stage 5 through to the end of the game. How the late game goes depends on a few factors. First is how well the early game went. If you manage to save a lot of health, you'll be in a much better position late game with a higher chance of placing in the top 4. The next factor is scouting. Scout to check how other players are positioning, what their compositions are, and to keep tabs on any major power spikes they hit, such as a 3-star champion or 2-star 5 cost. And the most important part of the late game is positioning. This is something players have to learn through trial and error, but basically always be aware of your board relative to everyone else's. By being diligent in scouting and repositioning your board, you will often win rounds you may otherwise have lost, which can improve what position you end the game in. As for level 9, well, it varies a lot. Reroll compositions that hit their power spike during Stage 3 usually coast to level 8 and 9 and transition towards playing strong 5-cost champions. Players that didn't hit those power spikes or played a standard mid-game will only be able to level to 9 if they have enough health and gold to do so. Keep in mind that you shouldn't level to 9 if you're about to lose a game unless you have around 30 gold left over to roll. This is because you won't be hitting any substantial upgrades if you spent all of your gold leveling. Instead, roll on level 8 to hit what you can, such as trying to hit a 2-star 5 cost or a 3-star champion. The golden rule is to never end the game with gold to spare. The last thing to touch on is Ornn. Ornn can be played anywhere from the mid to late game, but the later the game goes, the less value he has since he needs time to make artifacts. Artifacts can be huge boons to your board, so if you're ever able to fit Ornn in during Stage 5 and 6, try to do so. The power of each artifact does vary, but all of them will end up being useful in some way. That's all for today, folks. The meta may be reroll centric, but there's still plenty of other compositions to play. Let us know in the comment section below what you've enjoyed the most with the release of Set 4.5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.